welcome to the David Mosgrap Show. And my guest today is Karina Gould, Member of Parliament, Cabinet Minister a few times over, and candidate for leader of the Liberal Party and therefore Prime Minister of Canada. Welcome.
Thank you, David.
So we have a ton to talk about, and we're going to, as always, focus on policy. I'll leave the horse race stuff to other people. And I say this every time, but I hate to start with Donald Trump for all kinds of reasons. But I have no choice. This is top of mind. This is the pressing issue right now. It's increasingly pressing by the moment. So we're facing tariffs. We're facing them maybe next week, unless he changes his mind again. How do you respond to that? I mean, both as a general approach and specific tactical approaches. How do you respond to something like that?
Well, look, I think first of all, we have to have ice in our veins. I think we have to recognize that he's someone who's going to want to create chaos for his time in office. And we also know that, he likes being a reality TV star. So he likes the chaos, right? And he likes the splash and he likes the gotcha and he likes the reaction. And I think that, obviously we have to stand strong. We have to be firm. We have to be clear with who we are and what we offer and where our red lines are. But I think we also have to not always give him the reaction that he's looking for is important as well. But, from my perspective, it's just being very strong, very clear with him every single time that if it's Canada's sovereignty, it's not up for negotiation. Our economy is also not up for negotiation. And we will respond in kind and forcefully if we have to.
There's a growing consensus that Canadians, or at least in theory, are willing to put a lot on the line to deal
Mhm.
with Trump. Even, Stephen Harper comes out recently and says, I would impoverish Canada to deal with Trump and to preserve our sovereignty. We have a number of options. I mean, Canada's not in a weak position here, that we do have leverage. We have critical minerals. We have trade goods that the United States wants. We do have a trade relationship. We have all kinds of levers we can pull. Do any in particular stand out to you as more important than the others? Export controls on energy, on critical minerals, counter tariffs. What's the particular approach?
I mean, I think both of those are really important. And my suggestion would be that um, we not just go dollar for dollar. We actually say, you do this to us, we're going to hit you where it hurts. And if that means energy exports or it means, with auto parts, for example, you could say, well, you know what, if what you're worried about is fentanyl, we'll have to inspect every single auto part that is going across the border. We'll have to set up an entire committee to do that. That like I'm from Southern Ontario. The Buffalo Ford stamping plant would not exist if it were not for the Ford assembly plant. Those parts go across the border 5 to 8 times, right? That would be a huge slowdown and it would have a huge impact on the American auto industry, but it would also have a huge impact on delivery services in the United States because the US doesn't actually make auto parts in the US. They rely on Canada and Mexico. And that could shut down Amazon, FedEx, UPS, USPS within 30 days. So, Donald Trump, American people, don't pick this fight with Canada. We might not be bigger than you, but we are very smart and we are very strategic and we know how to do this. But we don't want to. So I think it's about seeing, what is dollar for dollar, but what is also the thing that is going to have the greatest impact that is going to say to both the American people, business leaders, Congress leaders to say, hey, please stop this President Trump because we can't afford this.
Yeah, and so we have these short term, even medium term responses, but we also face a larger long term
Mhm.
problem, which is we don't know if we can rely on our relationship with the
Yep.
United States anymore, right? Previously, we took it for granted. We took it
Yep.
for granted for the better part of, well, you could go back to aftermath of 1812, but certainly in the last 40, 50 years. Now, not so much. And how do we respond to a world in which we can't guarantee that trade relationship anymore, and we can't even guarantee that defense relationship anymore?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's like our economy is heavily dependent on the US, but our security situation is heavily dependent on the US as well. And we've taken both of those things for granted. But I think we've seen a fundamental shift in the United States. If I think about we learned a lot of lessons from the first Trump presidency, but then we kind of took a deep breath when Joe Biden was elected and assumed that maybe things were going to go back to normal. And I think what we've seen is that we're actually entering a new normal. And so, what does that look like? I don't think it means giving up on the relationship with the United States because, again, if I go back to our economy, a lot of our manufacturing relationship with the United States is intra-company trade. It's the same company that's sending things back and forth. It's not going to be as easy to diversify that. So I'm not someone who says, "Oh, we just have to trade with new trading partners," because that's not necessarily realistic for us either. So we have to work on that relationship. Same thing on the security side. Our defense system is so intertwined with the United States, also through NATO, through NORAD. This is an allyship that has developed over a long period of time. But what we are seeing is that the United States, under Donald Trump's leadership, but also under the broader Republican leadership, is turning away from the international order that they helped construct, and from the traditional allies that they've had. And so I think what this means for us is that we actually have to look at how we stand on our own 2 feet in Canada, how we develop stronger defense partnerships and relationships with other democracies and like minded countries around the world, both in Europe and in Asia, and really have a strategic vision for Canada moving into the future while still working on the relationship with the United States. I don't think we can just say, we're done with the US. I think we need to really continue to try to build that. And I think you know, it's not that we stopped having conversations with the United States after the first Trump presidency, but we maybe didn't engage in the same kind of Team Canada approach that we had taken during the first Trump presidency. And the lesson for me is that I don't think moving forward we can ever stop that Team Canada approach, because it's also about ensuring that everyday Americans have an appreciation for Canada and a recognition that this relationship is important. So, I heard some of my colleagues on the debate stage be like, well, I'm just going to stop talking to Donald Trump. And I was like, that's actually not how it works as prime minister. Like, you have to engage in that relationship. You have to be strong and firm. And you have to have ideas on what else you can do to protect and support Canada and Canadians. But I don't think you can just say, I'm going to cut off the United States. It's not that simple.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a contingent in Canada that's wisening up to the fact that this is a realpolitik moment that's going to take a very particular finessed and morally flexible approach. I see people say we're going to disinvite Trump from the G7. We're going to not have him at Kananaskis, and the response is, what does that get you? It strikes me that there's a moment where there's a lot of things we could do that would make us feel good, but might not deliver any tangible results. Like,
I think that's right. I mean, at the end of the day, we need to protect jobs and our economy, and we need to protect ourselves defensively. Look, having been a minister of international development, having been someone who represents Canada internationally, it might feel good not to talk to people, but it actually doesn't advance your issues. So you have to find ways to work together. You have to be very clear as to what your red lines are and what are things that are non-negotiable and are not up for discussion. But then you also have to be able to find ways as to where you can work together. And I think that what we've seen with President Trump previously is that, we were successful in renegotiating NAFTA. We were successful in having the steel and aluminum tariffs removed. I don't want these tariffs to happen ever, and the objective should be that they should never be on the table. But I do think that we can find a way to ensure that we understand what it is that he's after, and find a way to work together. And so, if it was the borders and if it was fentanyl, you know what? I don't want fentanyl in Canada either, right? And so let's work together on that. And I think we came up with a solution there. Now we're going to have to realize that he's probably always going to be moving the goalposts. If he's after critical minerals in Canada, well, maybe that's not, maybe there's a way to do that economically that's beneficial to Canada, but not in a way that compromises our sovereignty or our economy.
on defense, I mean, because the elephant in the room is that we need to have a serious think about defense in this country. And I want to get into spending in a second, but first I want to start with a broader philosophical discussion about what we think the role, yeah, of the Canadian
Mm,
forces is.
yeah.
In the 21st century, what it is, what do we want our military to be doing? Do we want a defensive force? Do we want a peacekeeping force? Do we want an offensive force? I mean, how do you approach the armed forces philosophically in the 21st century?
Oh, what a great question, David.
In
And
15 seconds or
yeah,
less.
but I mean, like, no one is having this conversation,
No.
right? Like, no one is actually talking about, like, what do we think we need as a defensive force or as the armed forces in Canada? Um, I think it's a combination. I think first of all, we have to ensure that we have the capability to defend ourselves. I think that we live in a scarier world than we did 10 years ago. And we need to ensure that we can protect Canada and Canadians. I think the conversation that is happening about the Arctic is really important. And I think we need to ensure that we have strong defensive capabilities in the Arctic. I think we need to have a serious conversation about NORAD and protecting ourselves from how should I put this? Like long range capacity
Mhm.
in Canada. You know, when was it? Like a couple of years ago when the balloons were flying over
Yeah.
Canada. Like there's stuff happening, and we need to make sure that we are prepared for that. Do I think that we need a bunch of tanks on Canadian soil? No, I don't. I don't think that's like 100 tanks in Canada is probably not going to make the difference for us if there's a ground invasion, and I think the possibility of a ground invasion is probably quite unlikely. But we need to make sure that we have the defensive capabilities, particularly in our airspace. Not that I think that that is an immediate threat, but I think we
Mhm.
have to ensure that we're keeping up with. I don't want to call them our adversaries, but the countries around the world that are more advanced militarily and who do not share our values, I think we need to ensure that we are keeping up with our defensive capabilities in that regard. Um, an offensive force, I'm not really sure that that is the specific objective. I think we need to ensure that our armed forces and our troops are prepared to um, be integrated and supportive with NATO. Look, what we're seeing in Ukraine right now, I think, is devastating for the democratic world. I think Trump has demonstrated that he is prepared to abandon the free world. And that is something that we should be very conscious of. And that means what do we need to do to shore up the alliance of free people? And democratic societies. And I think that is a very real conversation that we have to have. And we need to think about where Canada is best placed and where Canadians are best placed in that. And again, is that conventional or is that something that is newer and different? I think that's an open question. And then when it comes to peacekeeping, I mean, look, Lester Pearson is one of my favorite prime ministers, and I'm so proud as a Canadian that we came up with the concept. Peacekeeping is very different today than it was even 20 years ago. And it's less about peacekeeping and more about peace enforcement. I think Canada can play a greater role in some of the peace work that is being done around the world. But I think we also have to acknowledge that the vision of we have of the blue helmets is a very different reality today than it was decades ago, and we're talking a lot about a lot more conflicts that are um, they're internal, they're in the same country, they're protracted, they do not respect the norms of international conflict, and so it is a very different operation than it was, a decade or more ago. And I think we have to have a conversation about where Canada is best placed in that as well.
Um, you talked about getting military spending up to 2% of GDP, but by 2027, I think it was, right?
Mhm.
Uh, well, now these days, there's two immediate questions. The first is is that even going to be enough at this point? We've been debating this country over 2% for years, and now we wake up and we start looking and hearing 3%, 4%, 5%. We just saw what went down in the Oval Office between Donald Trump and President Zelensky just before recording. And people start to say, I go online and I see people saying, my God, we need conscription and 5%. Let's set that aside for a second.
Yeah.
Uh, it's easy to say you're for conscription when you're in your 40s and 50s, of course.
Yeah, I'm not sure conscription is.
Because no, not
Well,
necessarily
I know it's not
conscription,
the answer.
and conscription is not necessary.
No.
But I'm curious about whether or not we can even get to 2% by 2027. How do you scale up that quickly?
Mhm. Well, so first of all, we need to get to 2%, not because the United States is telling us to do it, but we need to do it because as Canadians, we need to do this. Like, as I mentioned, we're in a different world than we were previously. I mean, I think that most commentators on international affairs, if you had asked them 3 years ago if you would see war in Europe, they would have said no, right?
Mm.
So we just need to be attuned to the moment in which we are living, and I think uh, acknowledging that we should always be working for peace, but we need to be prepared to defend ourselves if needed. And so I do think 2% is possible. And I do think we need to do it. I'm not sure that we're at the point of having a conversation about 3, 4, 5%. But in my estimation, so we have both a recruitment and retention issue in our Canadian Armed Forces. So we need to recruit more people to even meet our standing force requirements and our reservist force requirements that we have right now. And we need to retain them. And in my opinion, what we pay our Canadian Armed Forces members is criminal. We ask them to put themselves on the line to be there for us when we need them. And our CAF personnel have been there for us at every turn, whether it's with regards to natural disasters at home, whether it's with regards to the COVID pandemic. I mean, who went into long term care facilities? CAF personnel, right? Like they have been our front line and our line of last defense, and they have always delivered for us. And then, when it comes to Ukraine, I mean, who is in Latvia right now? Our CAF personnel. So I think we need to pay them more. We need to increase their salaries. That's something that I would put in my very first budget to ensure that we are paying them better. And we also need to improve living conditions on reserve. We should move the Canadian Coast Guard into national defense. That should absolutely be part of our defense spending. And the other thing that I've said is we need a procurement czar. Military procurement in our country is like well, yeah, okay, I don't even need to say it, right?
No, no, no.
Like
Yeah,
it's terrible. It's
yeah.
terrible. And like not only do I want to ensure that the CAF are paid properly, or the Canadian Armed Forces are paid properly, but they should have access to the equipment and the tools and the resources that they need to do the job that we are asking them to do, and that they do well even under the circumstances. And we have military procurement on the docket that takes a very, very long time. And look, I'm not saying it's easy to build this stuff and to make it happen, but we need to do a better job, and we need to clean up defense procurement. And if we can procure some of these things faster, we can also increase our number.
Of course, that's going to cost money, which brings me to the economy. You've been part of the government for 10 years. For a good chunk of those years, the prime minister and the finance ministers have defended deficit spending with a fiscal anchor. We're going to spend a debt to GDP ratio that's sustainable, 1 to maybe 3%. Do you still buy that as an approach to budgeting?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who tells you they're going to balance the books in a couple of years is either not being straight with you, that they can achieve it, or they're not telling you about the cuts that they're planning on making. So, from my perspective, like, I'm not going to say to Canadians, like, I'm going to balance the books in 3 or 5 years, because I don't think that is realistic where we are without either without major cuts, right?
Mhm.
And I've heard some of my colleagues talk about, oh, we're gonna do it by growing the economy and increasing productivity. Absolutely, let's increase productivity and let's grow the economy, but we're probably not going to be able to do it fast enough to make up the difference in a couple of years. So, like, I don't think we are living in a moment where we can just say, we're going to balance the budget at all costs, because a couple of things. First of all, we might be facing the biggest shock to our economy with these Trump tariffs, that we are going to need to use the fiscal firepower of the federal government to support individual Canadians and businesses get through whatever period of time that looks like. And we want to ensure that those jobs in Canada are still here when we do eventually win in this tariff war. So we're going to have to think very carefully about that. And the other thing is that I'm about fiscal responsibility. I think we need to probably have more of an ongoing review of our spending and its effectiveness at the federal level, to make sure that we're doing it in a thoughtful way. I mean, when I heard recently how much the outsourcing to consultants has increased at a time when it was supposed to be decreasing, we have to do a better job of that. So I think there are ways for us to rein in spending. But I'm not going to say, like, look, I'm going to balance the books immediately, because I just don't think that's realistic.
On housing, we my lord, it's just crisis after crisis after crisis. I always try to think about some questions that will be a little bit hopeful and uplifting, and then I was like, well, I got nothing. So
No,
let's
there's
just
hope. There's hope, David.
we can get okay, good. Okay, we can get into hope towards the end, because that's nice when you come out of the valley. It's good to come in, but first we got to go a little deeper into the valley and talk about housing. And I'm curious specifically about whether you see a role for the state in non-market housing, because we've been talking about affordable housing forever. Housing's not more affordable. What about the non-market option?
Yeah, look, we need a better mix of housing in this country. I think we're one of the OECD countries with the lowest rate of non-market housing, and we also have some of the highest housing prices in the OECD. So there has to be a better balance, and I put forward a very ambitious housing plan, um, because housing is a crisis, and people spend way more of their take-home pay on housing than they're supposed to. I think the recommendation is about a quarter to a third. That's not even possible for most people in this country. Either it's rent or your mortgage. So I put forward a plan that looks to eliminate homelessness, um, massively build new housing, which would include non-market housing, particularly co-ops, in this country. And third, that will help first-time home buyers enter into the market. I just think that this is a crisis we absolutely have to tackle, and we have to be ambitious about it. And so for me, like, I'm a big fan of co-op housing in Canada. I have one down the street from my house, and it is a wonderful, vibrant community, and it brings people in along the continuum of housing affordability. It's not something that the federal government can do on its own. I think we have to keep working with municipalities and with provinces, but I really do believe that we need to increase housing stock, but we have to do it along the continuum of affordability, because I live in Ontario, and Doug Ford wants to build $1 million homes. There's not that many people that can actually afford $1 million homes. We need to do it at along the spectrum, and then we also have to create opportunities for affordable rentals as well. And in terms of ending homelessness, I want to do a big investment in the rapid housing initiative, again, to get people into homes, but then stabilized in their housing. And that would look like, agreements with provinces and territories to provide wraparound supports, so that you can get people off the streets into a home, but then you can keep them housed as well. And so that looks like mental health supports, addiction supports, job supports, so that once they're stabilized, if they're able, they can also enter the workforce.
I want to take a slight detour, because one of the most interesting things I found in your platform was you have a plan to decentralize the Liberal Party's structure. Now that's not going to be the most interesting thing for most people. That's fine. You can fast forward through this section, although I don't think you should. Uh, I found that tremendously interesting. And the implication there is you empower the party grassroots, and I think that's fantastic. Would you specifically weaken the prime minister's office and empower backbenchers as part of a broader strategy?
So I come from the grassroots of the party. I joined the party when I was 14, and I, loved going to conventions and debating policies and feeling like this was my opportunity to contribute to the betterment of my country. I want to see that more in the Liberal Party of Canada. I want us to have the great debates. I want us to push each other and challenge each other, and for that to be an acceptable thing. And that's because that's good for democracy, right? Like that is a good thing for
Mhm.
democracy. So I would like to see that. I would like to decentralize the Prime Minister's office. I think that I've had a few conversations with Jean Chrétien about how he ran his PMO. And I think it's important to let ministers be ministers. I will caveat that by saying that I never had a problem, sharing my feelings and my views and making my arguments with the current prime minister, and was often left alone to do my own thing. But the the fact of the matter for me is that like government should be by cabinet, and so cabinet ministers should be making their decisions. Um, I also have no problem with backbench MPs, sharing their views and having robust debates and dialogues. I that doesn't mean that I wouldn't whip votes.
Mhm.
There are some things that you can't like if you can't vote non-confidence in the government if you're
That's right.
you're part of the government,
You can't
right?
have the government falling every
No,
second
exactly.
week.
Like,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I'm not going to say like free votes for everyone.
yeah.
But I actually think the current structure of how we've done kind of like the three line whip makes sense moving forward. But I'm not afraid of people challenging me or pushing me on ideas and having those really robust debates. And I think we should have more of that.
I'm going to do that right now. Uh, you were Democratic Institutions Minister, something near and dear to my heart as a
Yeah.
recovering political scientist. Uh, Brief, uh, but recovering nonetheless. Do you support electoral reform? Where are you on that?
Um, I support what some of the folks want, which is a citizens' assembly. Um,
Oh,
I will say that when we were elected in 2015, we were pretty naive about how to do this. In the sense that we thought a parliamentary committee would be the right place and parliamentarians would come to an agreement and then they would all agree this is the right thing. But actually, it just turns out that every party was partisan about it and put forward their own idea and disagreed on everything except for no mandatory voting and no electronic voting. If citizens want to have this conversation, I have no intellectual argument against it. I'm not going to say that electoral reform is the number one thing that had got me into politics or that I would want to pursue as prime minister, but we live in a democracy. And so let's have a democratic conversation about it. And if people want to have a citizens assembly, they can do that and figure out what they want to put forward. And then if they do come to an agreement on what they want, I would put that to a referendum because I don't believe that we can change the electoral system without the buy in of Canadians. So I'm not going to say that it is the number one thing that I'm focused on, but I don't really have a good argument for not allowing that to happen.
I was before the ERRE committee back in the day, and this is exactly what I recommended. So therefore, I have no follow ups. I think you're exactly right. just I just wanted. I'm just very pleased to hear that. My little political scientist nerd. I studied deliberative democracy when I was doing my PhD, so my little political science heart just lit up when you said citizens assembly. Uh, so we came out of the valley a little bit. Let's go back into it. Climate change. You had mentioned that you would pause the consumer price hike, and that we would then talk about what to do. Would you ultimately replace the consumer price?
Um, It's not in my plans right now. I have no intention of increasing it. Let's have a conversation about it. If that's not the policy that's working for Canadians, let's have a conversation. But until we know what we're going to replace it with and what the alternative is and what the cost is to that, I'm not going to say like I'm just going to get rid of it. I will concede that we did a very poor job of engaging Canadians on this policy and on this topic. And so I hear Canadians when they say that now is not the time to increase it. But when they're talking about the carbon tax, what they're really talking about is affordability. And we know factually that the price on pollution is not the thing that has made life more unaffordable for Canadians. So, getting rid of it is not going to solve that problem. And that's why I also put forward a really ambitious plan to make life more affordable for Canadians, whether it's my housing plan. I've committed to decreasing the GST from 5 to 4% for 1 year. That's like $750 on average for Canadians a year, and to increase corporate taxes on the wealthiest companies in our country. So those that earn over $500 million a year in profit, from 15 to 17%, and to really strengthen our competition bureau because we have fake competition in this country. And so, if we were to actually give Canadians choices, we would have better prices.
That was the second part of your platform that caught my eye was the Competition Bureau. We're running out of time, so I don't have quite a time to dig into it, alas, because I know you've got quite a busy schedule, and I have to, related to the carbon price, I have to ask: did the decision of the government to carve out home heating oils undermine your capacity to sell the carbon price as a climate solution?
I don't think so. I don't think it did. Um, I think we were already under, like, we weren't able to sell it, so I don't think that that made much of a difference, to be honest. I think that we didn't understand what people were upset about at the time. Like,
Mhm.
if I think about, and this is a personal reflection of mine as well, like it was it was after the pandemic when inflation started to get out of control that Pierre Poilievre seized on the carbon tax. And he used it as a catch-all for why everything is unaffordable. That's not the reason. Like, it's just not the reason. But we didn't we as a government collectively did not take that seriously, his argument. And we also didn't capture, like, we didn't hear Canadians when they were saying to us, "My mortgage is out of control.
Mhm.
I can't afford groceries. Like, I'm really, really struggling right now." We were like, "We did such a great job on the pandemic," and we did do a good job on the pandemic. But I would often say to colleagues, like, Winston Churchill won the war and then he lost the election, because it's never about the past. It's always about the present and the future. And if you don't hear what your citizens are telling you in that moment, of course they're going to be frustrated. So, for me, I can really clearly see, like, when we were got disconnected from Canadians. And so that's why, like, and it's not that, like, yes, inflation has gone down, but the inflation that happened is now baked into the price of things. So costs haven't gone down. So what can we do actually as a federal government? And that's where I'm putting forward my plan on the things that we can do as a federal government to try to help make life more affordable for Canadians.
We've got about 2 minutes left, and this always happens. There's always deeply important questions that come towards the end of a conversation. You've got 2 minutes, but they're important to ask, so I want to ask. The first is on Gaza. We have a Gazan refugee resettlement program. It's not going well. Uh, do you have any sense of how we might improve it, or if you're elected, do you have an intention to continue it, or to grow it, or to otherwise try
Yeah,
to
I
fix
mean,
it?
look, it is a very challenging one, because part of the challenge is that it's not necessarily the decisions of the Canadian government that are what's slowing things down. I mean, it is the decisions of other governments. So yes, I would continue it, but it's still hard to get people out of Gaza. But I do think it's important to ensure that we are resettling people who have family connections here.
Well, that brings us right up against time, and I want to respect the fact that you've got quite a busy schedule. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I think we've covered quite a bit of terrain and quite substantively at that. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, David. I appreciate it too. Nice chatting to you.
You too, and good luck with your race. And to all those who listened, thank you as always for listening. We'll see you back here